So my name is Evie, and this is
Joffer.
together we're new affiliates. We run a New York City practice, as Oana well introduced. And a little bit about the talk, which will run on itself. We wanted to look back at a film by Philip Haas and David Hockney that is titled A Day in the Grand Canal with the Emperor of China, or Surface is Illusion, but So is Depth. In the film, the viewer joins David Hockney on a journey across a rather more typical 72-foot-long Chinese scroll from the 17th century. It's a really great film, and we encourage everybody to watch it. And that is for many reasons, for how it reminds us to look closely and look twice, and then look once again, to spend time with content that keeps unfolding the more one looks, and for its immediacy, even when it diverts into less accessible art historical theories. And most of it all for the delight that Hockney brings to life and expresses, that animates the characters and brings to focus some of the many, many stories in such a rich and kind of massive work. So we cover the format as a way to discuss our own, a little more atypical, as I put them, drawings in the other room, which we made specifically for the biennial at the beginning of this larger project of looking into the American architect Bruce Goff. For these, we looked beyond the building's form and spatial compositions and focused on the very rich and most unexpected material histories that brought those into being. But we'll talk about that more in a minute. Parallel to the Hockney-like slow walk of the drawings, we'll share a few faster interludes of our very own work. During our time spent with Goff's projects, we found echoes of what we really love the most in architecture practice. So we've used those as loose connections to introduce how some of the themes in his work from the 40s and 50s might reappear in our own work and practice today. The projects themselves are all covers of other known works or systems that we've inherited. And in other works, the theme spoke to our hearts and to our ethos as a practice. And we come today with a cover of a cover of a cover, covers times 3 of our own work, of Goff's work, and of Hockney's work. That's you.
So tonight, we're going to make a journey of 3 drawings. Each of these begins with a project by Bruce Goff. Each uses a design of one of his best-known houses as a starting point. We'll look closely at the architecture of each house and also at the material worlds from which they were produced. Bruce Goff worked with the American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, inventor of the Prairie style, which combined early modernism with American crafts. This is Bruce. These are 3 of his houses that we're going to talk about today. The Bavinger House on the left, the Ford House on the right, in the middle, and Shinnencon, or the Price House, on the right. Like Goff, they're expressive, flamboyant, unique, but also made out of everyday materials. It's our contention that these reveal a kind of flamboyant, super gay side of Goff, with which he brought to all of his architecture and what made us interested in him. Goff in his studio excelled at drawing atmospheres, perspectives, fantasies that were all apparent in the plans and the elevations themselves. We hoped in our covers of these drawings to combine elements of both and insert the cultural stories, as Evie mentioned, that produced what we find so interesting about his work. So this is the Bavinger House. The house was designed for 2 artists who wanted something weird and that they could build themselves with some help from local students and select contractors. The organization of our drawing is as follows. What you see on the vertical axis is stories about some of the material, social, and cultural histories that we're so interested in. But the horizontal, the x-axis, is the elevation unrolled of the house itself. The clients wanted something cheap and notable. Goff used this as a chance to start looking at industrial products that could work as architecture. But the house was also very much about its site. It was located in Norman, Oklahoma, and built in 1955, just south of Oklahoma City and above Texas. Here, we begin by looking at some trees. Like his teacher, Frank Lloyd Wright, Goff started with nature and sight. His early drawings of the house were all carefully embedded in nature. One couldn't exist without the other. As we scroll down, we just wanted to point out that one of the early decisions Goff made for the house was to use barked trees, i.e. the bark that was stripped from the trees as a way to tie the house back to nature through its deployment as windowsill and window frame, but really just to kind of sit within nature as a kind of site condition. Here we begin to see an edge of the roof itself. For Goff, the design began by embedding the house in the ground. At its lowest point, the roof hovers just above the landscape, creating an explicit connection to both the ground and the roof above, to the act of domesticity and its place in nature at large. We see the beginnings of the stone wall, the excavation here, creating a direct connection between excavation as an act and the architecture. So here's the stone wall as it begins within the house that's cleaved just above the landscape. Now we begin to move up the house's central axis. The house is organized around the spine, which hosts the suspension cables that hold up the spiraling roof, which we could say hangs down almost like a dress. It is the main structure, but also produces the primary formal organization of the home. It so happens that this spine is actually an oil drill, which Goff reused from a decommissioned oil rig. Oil extraction was central to Oklahoma's population boom. Maybe Goff was celebrating both its role in disuse and daily life, a reclaimed symbol of money and of its infrastructure.
So back to our work. We share this affinity for icons that emerge through critique of sort of major financial systems. And here, in response to the decorated drill, we have Scabby the rat. Years ago, we were asked to make a new souvenir for New York. And our idea was to look into this inflatable rat. He's known as Scabby and made his very first appearance in 1986 through the local 150 Union of Workers. And it highlights, it's meant to shame large-scale construction that does not deploy union labor. And even though, like, you know, many of us, he's not originally from New York, he actually started his career in Illinois, we cannot imagine the city decoupled from his presence. When one comes and visits, it's impossible to see sort of grand glass towers without seeing some Scabbies below. So as a souvenir, we wanted to position him somewhere between the Statue of Liberty, unique and iconic and formal, but also the yellow cab, and thinking about kind of the multiples that make something memorable. This way, we wanted Scabby to become a multiple and to become a counter icon that produces the real image of the city and the labor that brings it into being. So we made Scabby naturally into a desk lamp, which you see here, and exhibited him in a library, in a gallery, the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York, and he was available to purchase through the gallery for a number of years. No more.
Back to the Bavinger House. We're now scrolling through an imagined landscape of that same oil infrastructure. The tall oil towers, the relationship to land and water, and the implied connection to what's below the surface of the ground. Oil, for Goff, was both an economic condition, but also a spatial one. Here we see a fisher going about their work. Goff took material from the sea and fishing in many of his projects, which we'll see throughout this drawing analysis. Here, fishing nets themselves were used as enclosures in the Bavinger House. The family wanted no enclosed rooms, so instead, Goff designed these pods that you see here with fishing net walls, totally open and with no privacy. They were suspended from the roof, which in turn was suspended from the oil drill, and the rooms were suspended again, thus creating a set of nesting suspension conditions. As we start to move up, we see, coupled with the fishing net, fragments of steel cables. The plane that you see illustrated here is a biplane that emerged after World War II. Goff was very interested in military technology and its use after the Second World War, after a proliferation of technological development and building created a whole suite of new armatures. What could we do as architects in order to deploy them in real space? And so we used things like cables to create the same suspension as we saw holding the planes together. Right now, we're moving over towards a glass manufacturing plant. Glass, as you may have noticed in some of the earlier wall elevations, were really important to Goff's work. These are cullets you see, these blue fragments, that were sourced from waste areas of the local plate glass production facility, PPG, in Henrietta, Oklahoma. They produced this ice blue glass, which had a distinct color, which was a waste product and therefore basically free. It was hammered out of kilns after it was dried.
Here's Test Beds. It's an initiative that we started by looking at one of architecture's sort of most ubiquitous and sophisticated byproducts. And here you see a collection of large-scale mock-ups. These are one-to-one scaled pieces of architecture that are produced, by the same materials, the same teams, the same standards as kind of high-end construction, just as excerpts. And they're used to evaluate performance and visual qualities of those large buildings before they're actually built, and then they're very soon after trashed. So in kind of thinking about that perpetual flow that New York is exposed to of small parts of large buildings, impeccably made, trashing themselves, and looking at New York's disinvested, small-scale community gardens and their reciprocal structures, we thought maybe there is a relationship there that we could forge. So we started with a pilot project and in collaboration with the Parks Department in New York City, and took this one mock-up out of the sort of precursor of construction for a high-end condominium in Tribeca, and rehoused it, working together with a community group in Edgemere, Queens. So the journey of the mock-up was sort of started at Lower Manhattan on the upper left of the image, and it ended close to JFK Airport in Edgemere, Queens, a neighborhood that's as you can see, is in which kind of public space and space of collectivity, exchange, and knowledge becomes extremely important. So you see, it's actually, I love this image for how much it conceals the mock-up, even though it's the part that started it all. This is a series of rooms we designed together with a garden group, a classroom, a greenhouse, and a storage space, all held together under this larger roof. And sort of starting a dialogue between these two different parts of the city that typically don't quite speak to one another. So we imagine Test Beds not just about this one exchange, but as this perpetual back and forth between the city's areas of concentrated development and its outer boroughs. This one really had more time than I thought.
Back to these mock-ups in Goff's drawing. Now we're beginning to scroll down to the water pond below. One of the features of the house is not only was it kind of integrated but cleaved from the landscape, it also contained its own landscape. So under the floating pods, surrounded by fishing nets, were pools of water in the interior of the house. These pools demarcated spaces of domestic life, differentiating the space of the kitchen from the dining room, from the living room, and they were in fact full of water and plants and lily pads. You see here the stairs leading from the main entry space down to the same plane upon which the top of the surface of the water existed. And as we move further, a kind of diagrammatic illustration of the rocks forming the rock wall. So these rocks came together with the glass cullets that were mentioned above as a kind of act of labor that were undertaken, both with Goff's architecture students. So teaching was instrumental in the development of his practice, as with the clients. The clients were both art teachers at Oklahoma University. That's where they met. And so both art students and architecture students came together to produce the house at large. This is something that was really integral to a lot of Goff's work, this idea of inventing a kind of social condition, of bringing together industries. So here again, we passed by the truck that we'll come back to in a moment that brought all the rock to the site, back up to the PPG manufacturing plant. This idea of bodies that were both instrumental in the production of glass, to those that were instrumental to the production of the rock, to those that were instrumental in the production of knowledge, were all treated somewhat equally and all embedded in the same landscape, which is how they're represented here. So we go back up to the molten glass, but now actually situated against the mountainside with this aspirational ladder that you see here. and a person dynamiting what appears to be a small mountain. So one anecdote about this house is that Goff convinced his clients to purchase a bunch of land 3 miles from the house under which sat all this rock that he was interested in, which is called iron rock. And the students themselves blew up the rock and carried it all to the site. It was 200 tons that were taken over the course of many weeks in a single small-scale pickup truck in the back of a pickup truck that belonged to Gene Bavinger, the client of the project. And by hand, they moved the rock into formation into this house. The rocks and the cullet wall together were 96 feet in linear length, but they produced a logarithmically generated spiral. This is the 1947 Chevy pickup truck that was used to carry all of the rock, as you see in its back. And the students, along with a couple select contractors, are the ones who actually built the wall and placed the cullets and dug out all the landscapes, etc. So you start to see that labor, teaching, and sort of different bodies coming together were very important in the kind of production of this as an experiment. A lot of Goff's work couldn't be built by typical architectural drawings, so it was a combination of these fantastical drawings that we showed at the very beginning that we're so fascinated by, coupled with new forms of expertise that were produced. So as the drawing began, so it ends with a kind of view of nature. I think once you start moving and weaving through this narrative that kind of pits together industry, military, and the home, you see maybe Goff's departure from Frank Lloyd Wright, who was so convinced by the idea of commingling nature and building, and to cleave it into something totally new and distinct. So this house is another house entirely. This is the Ford House that was done just 50 miles outside of Chicago in Aurora, Illinois, and it was completed in 1955. So the Ford House, unlike the Bavinger House, was arranged over a radial grid, which we start to see here. And it was produced through a series of circles and kind of intersecting volumes, so rectangles and these other kind of funny moments. During the construction of the house, notably, the owners put up a sign on the site that said at the bottom, "We don't like your house either." In other words, they knew how unpopular this architecture would be, and they wanted to kind of nip in the bud the critique that they knew was forthcoming. Unlike the Bavinger House, where we start with nature, here we start with a game. This is a game of marbles played by a bunch of small children. And Goff, for this project, was inspired by a lot of dollar store trinkets, so things that he could find at any pharmacy, including these marbles, which were used as a new kind of addition to the hybrid wall. So we thought we'd start here with the wall that we maybe ended on in the Bavinger House. And this one, too, features rock and cullet, much like the Bavinger House, but with the addition of these marbles, which produced all of these kind of amazing light effects that Goff was really intrigued by. There are moments in Goff's production where it really feels like he's just taking anything he can get his hands on to add something sparkly or joyous or draggy to an existing typology. Also, like the Bavinger House, here we're showing this wall unrolled. So in fact, as you see in the top right corner here, it was curved along the main circle of the wall that demarcated the limit of the house. Here we start to pan up and we see maybe the underside of two people having a conversation. For this drawing, we wanted to use what we might think of as a worm's eye plan perspective view because of the relationship of the plan to the roof and the ceiling, which were incredibly important in kind of producing a collage material effect. Here we move over to a boat. Specifically, this was a naval boat that was used also in World War II. You can connect it back to the planes from the Bavinger House. Goff served in the military, which will come up again later on in this drawing, and took signifiers, symbols, materials from that time to apply to his house designs. So you see here the move of this rope that starts as a naval rope on the deck of the boat and turns into this soffit cladding for the underside of the ceiling of the carport. So the rope was basically used to trace and outline the geometry of the ceiling and produce this amazing material effect.
Goff's use of marine rope here as articulated surface and really as ornament is fascinating to us. We think about surface and the aesthetics of reused materials more often than not. We think about how blank surfaces are everything but economical and how wasteful kind of seamlessness is in architectural production. They're demanding and kind of particular in their effort to appear continuous, blank, and anonymous. So in this work, which we titled Drywall is Forever, we made it 4 biennial in 2019, and it started with this acknowledgement that, especially in the context of the art world, we build as often as we unbuilt, and drywall ends up, in the previous photograph, in all too many instances in landfills or in recycling facilities in such a small fragment of the amount of demolition material. So we decided to go out into the world of New York City, a world that's very much kind of very vibrant in terms of its cultural and art production, and call up galleries and museums and ask for their demolition leftovers of drywall within a single month. So we created this new network of discarded drywall out in a studio of our own and staged this faux white cube, a sort of critique to the white blank space in which we're presupposed or left with a legacy of modernist viewing of art in an asynchronous, apolitical, AAA kind of space of blankness and resistance. In our case, we imagined a white cube that carries the scars of its reused material, of its rough edges, and of the buffer between different thicknesses of drywall as ornaments, and produces a new aesthetic that's actually just as appealing as the blankness of what we started with. Most recently, we had a chance to restage the piece at an exhibition titled Energies, and aptly host a series of work that's dealt with material exhaustion in the context of New York City at large. So that was Drywall is Forever 2.
Back to the carport. Here we begin to track back to the center of the drawing once again. As we move back into the house, we see both the plan and also notice some of the built-in furniture, which you see rendered in dark black. A bookshelf, the bench, the kitchen counter, for example. The kitchen counter is the one where the 2 feet are standing and the rest of the body disappears. As we begin to pan back up, we can see the naval rope weaving over the interior spaces as well, adding another character in the collage of surfaces at the house's ceiling that we found so compelling. As we start to move out into the grid space that tracks the kind of interplay of the radial grid with some of the architecture beyond, we see this unfolded white trace of the central chimney as it unfolds from the plan perspective, and we turn it into the elevation that's shown here. The chimney is the largest of the house's built-ins. It's both the hearth, but also connects the interior and exterior. It comes to a point, but also begins to gather and collect the frame, which we'll describe more in a moment. It hosts this mezzanine platform that you can see now, which in turn hosts 2 wing stairs on either side. It produces the kitchen and centralizes the main use programs of the central living area. So you can see in it essentially an analog to the oil drill that was used previously. But in this case, rather than acting as the primary structure, though it does serve a structural purpose, it acts instead here as a primary programmatic generator. There's a giant rubber tree inside the house, which is plastered against the glass, and you see scanning past right now, which is a mirror to the nature beyond. Once again, cleaving the kind of image of the inside and outside, rather than just blending it, as Frank Lloyd Wright may have done. Here we start to move into one of the 2 primary bedrooms, which was intersected by a closet wall from one side and a roof that extends to the exterior. As we move over, we start to see another unfolding roof of another structure, extending the idea of intersection outside of the house and into the world of reference. This is a Quonset hut. Apparently, Goff designed buildings for the Navy during World War II, and there became acquainted with the versatile Quonset hut, a demountable steel structure with a distinctive half-tubular shape and ribs that probably now look very familiar after you've seen other parts of the drawing. Here we're seeing evidence of barrack life, boots, guns, beds unmade, beds made, signs of life that Goff would have been very familiar with.
So a more direct connection to the Quonset hut is the contemporary pre-engineered building. Fascinating for us for its embodied expertise. It's really a building you can go on this very website, among others, and just configure yourself and order it, even when you're not an architect. In many parts of the world and across the United States, as in other places, you can see it take on the form of, everything and anything. You can find it as a storage space, as a home, as a villa, as a garage, a carport, a boatport, you name it. There's nothing you can't really do with this very simple kind of repeatable system. So we used it in Vermont for a home in Tunbridge, a home that's made of a series of bays, some sort of tightly enclosed, some loosely connected, and a couple of open bays into the nature. And you see it here. We sort of thought of it as a permanent structure that's clad with a softer, more malleable, more articulated wood framing structure that's the prevalent way of building in Vermont. The two came together, and it's a sort of building that's stacked into a soft hill. On the one side, you see here in the back of the kitchen, kind of tacked into nature with a concrete wall, and on the other completely open onto the hill. The challenge really is how to produce something that has been so atmospheric while off the shelf.
We now return to the Ford house itself and begin to see the adaptation in these white lines of the Quonset ribs into a radial structure. Goff did two things with the ribs. He turned them sideways, and he arranged them into a radial form instead of a solid rectangle in plan. Thus, the tube, which is a half tube, becomes a donut in the Ford house. And this donut was, in half the house, totally exposed, although it was partly buried in the other. The frame becomes the house's dominant motif. So this idea of the adaptation of the Quonset hut is central to the production of the aesthetic of the actual building. While complete in plan, the enclosed house is only a portion of the full circle. The fireplace that you see in the middle is double-sided, facing both inside and out, and the patio seating area is under the exposed ribs. So the shape is always implied, though it's redistributed by the interior organization. This is the second bedroom, which is much like the first, intersected by both the kind of rectangular volume of the bathroom and the planar ceiling above. Here we begin to see how the naval rope and the walls together formed a kind of bizarre, delaminated facade. So following broader modernist principles, Goff was interested in materials that flowed from outside to in, cut only by the nearly invisible line of the window, whose frame was actually embedded into the ceiling so as to appear virtually seamless. Form, stone wall, and ceiling all work together to cross boundaries between an enclosed interior and the world beyond. So as we zoom out, just a note that Goff's interest in the military, the Navy, and in toys, i.e. the frame, the surface, and the marbles, conspired together to make a house that was both bizarre in its form and subversive in the deployment of its systems and its decorations. In other words, he put a military technology into drag, a flamboyant expression of new forms of living, domesticity, and joy. Next up, in our final drawing, this is the Price House, otherwise known as Shinnencon. The house was first built in 1956, but it was extended in 1966 and again in 1974. The client was a longtime patron. Joe Price was heir to the same fortune that built Frank Lloyd Wright's infamous Price Tower, which is actually currently being sold. The house was for a young bachelor who would later marry and start a family. hence the growing of the structure. It was located in the remote Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and very much took its inspiration from the landscape, which extended on all sides in vast, sweeping plains. This drawing shows a plan with built-in volumes extruded. Its exterior walls are folded down as though they were made of cardboard, showing a new relationship between enclosure and interior. The architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable called the house a Playboy dream if Playboy was an architect. Built-in seating, conversation pits, and a landscape of carpets and pillows made the interior a dense canvas of textures. This, however, was not without Goff's typical sense of humor. For that, and as you begin to see below, Goff began with the grocery store, a consumer space full of colors and textures. Notably, he started with the development of cellophane, which was used to keep food fresh in a cover of shiny, indestructible plastic. The material was everywhere, shrink-wrapped and strange. This is part of the Goff archive, in which he collects everything from tile samples to carpets to bits of plastic, all gathered both from the dollar store and from grocery stores in general. As we pan up, you begin to see the collection of all of the surfaces that form the elevation as they come together, and you see this thread of the plastic cellophane as it wraps up and weaves its way into the home. Goff used cellophane as a centerpiece in the house's main room, but transformed it into a kind of hanging display, which we begin to reveal here. It became something like a chandelier that was cut into strips and would move in the breeze and meant to look a little bit like rain. From afar, the installation looked at home amidst anodized metal panels and exotic zebra wood surfaces. But this was Goff's wink, once again. At the heart of the building, a piece of cheap plastic, which was totally at home in its otherwise completely specific, materially rich, and, frankly, expensive surroundings.
We also kind of like plastic. We've used it plenty. We find it fascinating in greenhouses and, the store. You can cut it and form it and use it yourself. And there's something, there's something about it that compels to us. So we made this series of 5 tiny structures for 5 gardens, referencing, the simple, a very known umbrella brought together with a very known chair. And it was something between like this combined piece of furniture and a tiny, smallest module of architecture one could imagine. If you cannot have enclosure, then maybe you can have a roof for one person. So that was a small installation we made over the pandemic across the 5 boroughs of New York. And amazingly, the first garden we went to install at, we found the very same plastic across the street, and that, wasn't a choice. Like, we didn't choose the green. That was the green that was available at the store during a time of lack of materials. And we brought those together, and sort of people enjoyed them very much as gardens were becoming more and more important as a place to get together and kind of even in your alone sphere at those early days. It kind of came as a continuation of us working with community gardens and green thumbs, over 500 kind of civically run but community-led green and open spaces. For us, even though each piece was smaller, it kind of signified a continuous roof across all of New York. And we imagined they kept proliferating almost like an invisible forest across the city and kind of brought these individual gardens together.
So here we are, back at the center of the house, looking at the rain as hung from the triangular roof structure with its beams that point in the 3 principal directions of the structure itself. We can start to unpack all of the textures, the cellophane rain, the carpet, the floor tile, the wall, that all come together at various seams that we've deliberately unrolled here. The pillows, the slippers, and the speakers all become sensuous affects that begin to attach themselves in temporary configurations to those self-same surfaces. As we pan down and over, we begin to see the edges of these two large chimney volumes that interrupted the first corridor and kind of created a thick threshold or grand gate that would eventually lead us into the first bedroom. This bedroom was deliberately in line with the living room. This is what we think Ada Louise Huxtable meant about a Playboy architecture. The axis of living room, conversation pit, and carpeted interior was never too far from the bed itself. We begin to see also above these cathedral-like windows that looked out onto the landscape. And again, another accent of this cullet wall with its stones that comes to the exterior. So this forms a kind of T at the head of the bed and then comes outside and begins to kind of cleave the landscape out there. It becomes less architecturally formal, less rigid in its solid geometry, more organic and naturalistic as it moves outside. In this case, demarcating a small pond that was just outside that bedroom. You see the oranges wrapped in cellophane in the foreground. In terms of the drawing itself, you might notice the shadow of the house actually produces another form of limitation of the drawing and starts to separate some of these scenes. So the shadow is actually produced by the actual volume of the house, not its unfolded state, but also begins to divide some of the spaces of the narrative of the drawing. Here we begin to move towards a new factory space that you start to see here, past this brick wall and up to yet another person working and producing the glass cullet. Goff, as you probably noticed at this point, was quite fond of cullet. He gathered it from many places. It was always free. At the Price House, the bedroom walls were made of chunks of coal from Kentucky, so again, another use of coal, a seemingly improbable material, and glass cullets from the Liberty glass plant near Sapulpa, which is also in Oklahoma, which was primarily known for producing Coke bottles, as you start to see here. If we consider that the glass at the Bavinger House came from window manufacturing, the glass at the Price House is more closely aligned to the grocery store, referencing more fun things like pop culture, food, and caffeine. As we begin to pan back into the house, we once again see the unfolded wood surfaces. This is a zebra wood. So for the ceiling plane, it was done at one orientation and turned 90 degrees for the wall, coupled here against a kind of backdrop of the Coke bottle manufacturing plant. So again, the juxtaposition of zebra wood and Coke bottle cullets felt really important to the way Goff worked. Here we're moving back into the main entrance of the house. So the entrance was connected to a dramatic entry sequence, a long driveway with gates that match some of the decorative ornaments within. Goff even got involved in decorating the driveway, covering trees and gold baubles that he refused to let the owners remove to connect to some of the interior materials. The main doors to the house featured triangulated glass panels, and these led into these culleted volumes and into the carpeted interior. It was a long transition into a centralized space, deliberate, picturesque, and built around materials that created, once again, a collage set of diagonal planes. That's what we see at the kind of corner of this roof condition here, the large-scale speaker below. On the right side of where we're standing now, you see a diamond-shaped window that's cut into the carpeted wall. These windows were very specific to the house and also purchased as prefabricated modules that were typically used for boat design. Here, as we pan up, we start to see a new surface at the bottom right of the image, alongside some geese. And these geese are enclosed by a partial fence. And here we see them situated next to a pile of feathers. Some of them are mid-flight. Goff used goose feathers that were typically made for costume design inside the house, drawing from another inspiration perhaps further afield from the Coke bottles and grocery store cellophane, but equally popular in their cultural references. We might begin to think of things like feather boas and decorative dress edges, of movements and of effect, of partying and of joy and of fun, of the club.
And reuse comes into play in many of our projects. It is our most common starting point for design. Instead of sort of bringing something into the world anew, we imagine reassigning value to something that's forgotten or abandoned or at the wrong place at the wrong time. And each work responds to a different time scale. The time to build a building, it's years, or the time of an exhibition, it's months, and here the timeline of a party is just a few hours. So in designing this single night party at this vast manufacturing space, at the center of a large manufacturing area of New York City, in Brooklyn, we found these panels that were left over out of a Mariah Carey concert for one. So we thought we would just bring them into the space and fill it. And we thought, how do we keep them together and make a joint that will last just one night? So we called up this ice sculptor, and we held them into place with this like really beautifully sculpted pieces of ice, which at the end of the party, as you see in this final photograph of the project, melted away into the sewage system of the city.
The effect of the feathers for Gough may have referenced other kinds of spaces, but also made for a spectacular light effect, a soft, glistening surface right under the main skylight of the house. So here we move back into the house, and we begin to see down to the final third axis of its interior. So here again, we see the deployment of the goose feathers, which were situated directly above the cellophane. So once again, kind of experimental epicenter of Gough's intervention. And down this axis, past these final two cullet wall volumes, which housed closets and service spaces, another set of these geometric cathedral-like windows, and down to the final cullet wall, which again in turn projected itself out and into this pond whose edges actually followed the same triangulated grid as the interior tiles. So there was both a sense of this kind of organicist freedom in the kind of shaping of the wall, coupled with the kind of bizarre geometrically cut tiles of the ponds, which again feels a bit like the kind of central tension that was evident in most of Gough's work. So the Price House played between the idea of the soft and the hard, between carpet and goose feather applied to sharp, angled surfaces and sawtooth cuts. Price was fascinated by Japan, and while Gough used that as a starting point, he also needed to couple the kitsch of post-war American products. We see the feedback and the tension of these constantly playing out, in turn, like the Ford House before it and the Bavinger before that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh my God, okay, thanks for letting us engage that experiment of timing. I will say Hockney's video that we based this on was a lot less morose, but I think that was just because of trying to figure out how to stay on time for this. But we did, just to echo Evie's point at the start of the conversation, really want to linger on the detail of the drawings. We think in terms of architectural production. Oftentimes we make things and we kind of put them in the world and we just say, yeah, you can look at them and it's fine. But it really felt like in the kind of Hockney reference, there was this amazing kind of attention to the most absurd and ridiculous details that feels meditative, and that's what you're trying to do. But in the spirit of breaking script for a minute, if anyone has questions, we're also happy to answer them and don't need to be so self-serious. Thanks. Do you want a microphone? Take mine.
I think we
Yeah,
need,
no,
I think
but we can
need
share.
it for the,
Yeah, we can back and forth.
yeah, we need it for the recording. Thank you. I was just wondering, so you said that this last house you presented was extended several times after it was built, but the other ones are still in their original shape? Because I noticed that there's a certain arrogance in the way that technology and materials are embedded in the house. So I wonder how are they faring, like with how specific the material needs were for the houses when it's time to change them or change those speakers from the 60s that you put in the walls. How does it work? Is that something you're also looking into?
That's a really great question, actually, and you can keep the mic. I think we can share, and if that might prompt someone else to ask a question. So just encouraging everybody. No, that's a really perceptive question. So the second house, that is the Ford house, we had a chance to visit, and it's actually purchased and cared for by an architectural historian who, would rather sleep in uncomfortable ways than, mess with a masterpiece, right? So it takes a lot of kind of effort and care and maintenance and dedication to the house itself to kind of keep going. We had a chance to visit a different Goff house that is not featured in the lecture that was cared for, and I think cared for is the right word. There's no inhabitants, and the house kind of dictates their lives rather than the other way around. It was cared for by the late wife of another architect who saw himself in dialogue with the Goff house and kept...
She's not late.
No, her husband was the architect.
Yeah, he was still alive. He was in the house when we were there.
Oh, whoops.
Everyone was alive.
I truly thought that person was not alive. Okay, great.
He was literally inside the house when we were touring it. They said we couldn't go in this one bedroom because he was recuperating in it.
Oh, I guess recuperating is a new word for me. Anyhow, but her husband, who apparently is very alive, and gosh, this is recorded and now this has gone terribly, but her husband has made multiple kind of alteration to the house. Most importantly, do insulated windows. These are all single pane glass, kind of bring it up to standards of living. You want to share what happens to the most dramatic house?
Well, the important thing is that 2 of these 3 houses have burned down. So actually the only one that exists is the Ford house. And there's an amazing story with, not this house, but the Bavinger, the first one we showed, that apparently there's an active theory that it was the son of the family who designed the house with Goff that burned it down. And what was particularly funny about that is that while we were kind of studying the plan, we kept thinking, what kind of parents would force their kids into these sleeping pods with no walls, held in fishnets, never with any privacy? And of course, lo and behold, a rabbit hole of Wikipedia and weird news articles later, we discover that it's actually most likely that the son burned it down. Probably out of a sense of resentment towards being forced into this atypical domestic living situation. But it is, you said that there's an arrogance, and I agree with you. But I did want to just make a note that one of the things that is interesting about Goff is how, let's say, dialogic he was with his clients in terms of producing design. So it never really felt like the megalomaniac designer, just kind of forcing a vision onto a family, but instead the kind of production of a conversation between client and architect. Arrogance I agree with in the sense, how do you replace things? It's all idiosyncratic, nothing is customizable, nothing is standard, but it was maybe a collective arrogance and not a singular one.
Yeah, and I also want to situate this in modernism, right? Everyone invented everything during that time. Heating systems were up for grabs. Membrane systems were up for grabs. Roofs were up for grabs. Anyone did whatever, and brought systems into being rather than today, following a catalog of typical details and materials that clasp together with no kind of projective contributions by the architect. So yes, surely these houses are wildly idiosyncratic, but they are not quite an anomaly in the context of 40s, 50s practice. And what's really exceptional is that as different as these 3 houses are, all of these houses are individual. And I think it echoes what Jaffer was referencing as his collaborative nature.
Sorry, dramatic. Two-pronged question. Well, one, can you speak a little bit to the context of how you got to do this and why Goff and what the larger project is? But then the other thing, you were calling him dialogic, but in a way I find in your work, also in the kind of exceptional installations that you're doing or collaborations you're doing with artists, and even here, I feel there's a big interest also in others or others' ways of doing things, or maybe not, maybe you're just forced into it against your will. I'm just curious, can you speak a little bit to that? In a way, what did this give you, and of course where it's going, but then also to some of your other projects in collaborating with, yeah.
So maybe the really simple answer to the question, the first prong of the question, which is what is this in service of? So as Oana mentioned in the generous introduction, thank you, we do a lot of work with museums and on exhibitions in addition to more kind of normative architectural work, residential, et cetera, commercial. And we have been hired to do a project at the Art Institute in Chicago that opens at the end of next year, so the end of 2025, about a year and 2 months from now, on a retrospective of Bruce Goff. It's the most large-scale show of his work that has hundreds of drawings in it and these amazing paintings that he's done, and they're all super cool. And so this project came out of, a part of that is that we were hired in addition to the exhibition design and layout, to do 3 installations, which have now actually merged into one kind of mega installation that actually responds to his legacy in these 3 houses. So when Oana asked us to participate in this, it was just like, okay, well, we're already covering this architect. This is just the perfect kind of alibi or excuse to kind of combine that research with this. And so these 3 drawings, actually, they are obviously exploring a certain kind of formal and aesthetic registers, but they're really authentically and earnestly a way for us to kind of come to terms with Goff's drawings and Goff's style and the architecture and like understand it in a different way. So it's very productive in that sense. What was this? The second part of your question has to do with our collaboration in general.
Yeah, and I find there's a interest in dialogue or in other. It's not that oftentimes people isolate within their practice, but I feel yours is very sort of social, kind of, from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give the dumb version, and then Evie can respond with the smart one. But I think we deliberately called ourselves New Affiliates because we didn't want to use our names. We didn't want something that felt introverted or about us, but actually affiliations at large are about an externalization of self. So it's like you affiliate with others new. We are no longer new. We're kind of new, but it's not relevant because every time we take on a project, it's a new affiliation. We're always new affiliates to someone. So yeah, I mean, I think just embedded in the kind of like birth of our practice was the sense that we don't like being in a room alone together, that just like we just fight and it's awful, but we actually get along much better with the world around us and we respond to it. So I think that there's a bit of like a horror vacui, like we don't like emptiness, we like context, we like sight, we like people, and we'd much rather design through those collaborations than on our own.
Yeah. No, this is all very true, and again, like not very different than what all architects do, right? You never work alone, really, and neither of us is the type of maker that wants to go into a room and tell people what to do. We're really good, like, I don't know, Jaffer comes from journalism, and I think he's always interviewing our clients. Like, I come from a place of, I don't know, reading fiction my whole life, and I'm always thinking like, someone is like revealing themselves to me. There's like a desire to understand those around us. And, through that, most of our work that keeps us going and keeps like our business, our place of work active is kind of powered by others. But also when we do find ourselves alone, we default into a model of self-critique. So a lot of our projects come out of critique of practice, our own practice as we make it. Like, for example, the Drywall project came after doing a dozen one-off exhibitions, sometimes for the same institution. So we would leave a meeting and see our own installation in a trash can, and we would say, oh man, what do we do? Like, we're Munster, how we participate in this? We don't do things, and you see it's singular Munster because I'm alone in the Munsterness, but I don't want to put you there. But I think this process of self-critique and the critique of others and the sort of infinite circle of production leaves us with projects like this one where we're commissioned to do A and we end up also doing B because we need to reconcile what A did for ourselves and for the world around us.
Maybe one more. I mean, I have many, but can you speak to teaching and how that influences or how that ties to your practice, if at all? You're both teaching at widely successful schools, or should we have Chris answer this?
May Chris answer.
I would love to hear from Chris. Yeah, that's a good question, and I find ourselves over the years to answer it very differently every year that goes by. In the very beginnings, teaching was a source of stability for a model of practice that was selective, if that's the right word. That sounds arrogant, so I would say, a model of practice that was controlled in some way. And over the years, I think it's become, like, I think we went through a phase where teaching was let's say, from stability to think about this a little more carefully, because I always regret this answer, actually. To a place of really experimentation, what school is supposed to be. And we're now, at least I find myself at a place where teaching is a source of, like, really learning more than you actually teach. You know, it's a place where you can put your ideas into action. It's a place where you can hear from others and to have colleagues and have community. There's something about the specifics of a small practice. We have an office that's not, 20, 30, 40 people. We're usually within a team of 5 or 6 people working together closely as design teams. And I think that's, I don't know, it lacks community often, and like school gives you that support of like-minded thinkers or thinkers who are exactly opposite than you. And I think that's what most recently I've appreciated the most in teaching. And maybe space from each other, to your earlier point.
Yeah, I would say maybe first off, I'm like, look at the camera, assuming it's still on, and say, this is a drawing, all 3 of these drawings were done with students that we worked with. So thank you to Ekin Bilal and Ruby Kang, who worked on this project. So I mean, there's a very, very simple version of this, which is that, like, we love students, we love learning from them, we love teaching them, and we love hiring them. And it sort of does keep things in our perspectives quite fresh. I mean, I think this drawing wouldn't have really been possible without some of the work that particularly Ekin did. I worked with him on his thesis, and some of the style that is here is like partly his, and full credit to him for that. So, but I think one could unpack that a little bit and say it's not just about the practicality of hiring, but it's actually about like the ways in which teaching provides, maybe echoing some of Evie's answers, a constant set of synthetic learning feedback loops, where it's like you cannot teach and not learn, and I think that that alone is a kind of like beautiful and amazing thing. And we used to do this thing where we would only teach 1 semester a year each, and I even found that like practically worked a lot better for us. We were much more productive as an office. But between summer and a semester out, I would actually really miss it. Like, 12 weeks a year of teaching is not quite enough to really feel like you're getting as much as you want. So I think that it is about the kind of dialogue, it's about pushing ourselves. And also, I mean, in the darkest moments of self-critique, I would say that these drawings, which I love, are kind of student-y drawings, but they're like nice student-y drawings. Like, we get an A, I think, from ourselves. But I think that the issue is that calling it a student drawing is sort of in a self-critical way, a kind of derogatory thing to say, but why should that be derogatory when in fact our referent here, Bruce Goff, was making drawings that were as fantastical throughout his entire career, and I would argue learning really instrumental things about the projects from them. So in putting these together, we put together things that we would never show a client necessarily, that like we probably wouldn't even show the Art Institute. This just isn't how we would make things to get paid. It extracts us out of the kind of service model, and it puts us into some other place. And I think that other place is nebulous, no pun intended with all the clouds in this drawing, but I think it's both nebulous and it's exciting, and things come out of it that you can't predict. Any other questions before we end? Thanks for bearing with us, everybody. Thanks, Perry.
You thoroughly enjoyed it. So did we. Thank you so much. And thank you, Chris.